Hey everyone, welcome back to another Stone Ocean review. Today we're going over chapters 60 to 74. It's quite a bit of chapters. Basic, quick summary. Jolene is in the Ultra Security Punishment Ward when she sees two guards outside fighting. One of the guards is a guy named Guard Westwood. And this guy, Westwood, defeats the other guy. And they're just sort of fighting because Poochie has sent to that punishment ward a stand called Survivor. And what this stand does is that, a person is the user. And then electric currents go down their body and travel across the ground and reach other people. And these currents stimulate people's limbic systems and activate their fighting spirit. So it makes everyone super angry and wants to fight one another. So someone in this punishment ward has Survivor. And now everyone is fighting. So people who are affected by this stand can see each other's, can see people's weak points and strong points of their body so they can fight better. So Jolene gets into a fight with this Guard Westwood guy, and it's a crazy fight. He has a stand called Planet Waves, where meteors from space are attracted to him. When they reach him, they burn up. They don't affect him. But if he has someone in front of him, the meteors can hit that person. So Jolene has to outsmart him a little bit. She puts a brick into a shoe and puts it in front of her. So the meteor hits the brick in the shoe, and it sort of, puts some force into the brick in the shoe, burns the brick in the shoe. So the brick in the shoe hit Guard Westwood even when the meteor can't. So Guard Westwood is defeated. But during the Westwood fight, Jolene had actually seen someone pick up the Dio bone. She found the bone while she was fighting him, but then this little guy came out and picked it up and took it. So now she wants to go chase after this little guy now that she's defeated Westwood. But then two guys come out. Two guys survive after the big fight in the punishment ward. One of them is this guy named Kenzo, who has a stand that uses feng shui. The stand is called Dragon's Dream, and basically it sort of points out lucky and unlucky areas. That's sort of the concept of feng shui. It sort of shows you what areas are lucky and which ones are unlucky. It sort of guides how some people build their houses, facing lucky directions and not facing unlucky directions. And so this stand, Dragon's Dream, sort of shows Kenzo the best areas to attack from, the best areas to go to keep himself safe. Fortunately, Foo Fighters and Anasui show up to help. Anasui sort of stays back while Foo Fighters fights. It's a big, crazy fight. Kenzo is pretty unstoppable. But then Foo Fighters gets knocked down to the lower parts of the punishment ward where the electric chairs actually are, and Foo Fighters uses some water to make a mirror. So Kenzo looks at the mirror and sees the reflection of Dragon's Dream. So he goes to a spot that he thinks is a safe zone, but actually isn't, because he's looking at just a reflection. So when Foo Fighters gets into the electric chair, they get electrocuted, and Kenzo is in an unsafe zone, so he gets electrocuted too. And then Foo Fighters is still alive, because they put some little plankton in a safe area. So the little plankton are fine, even though the main body of Foo Fighters got electrocuted pretty badly. But fortunately, Anasui shows up, and when Kenzo tries to attack Jolene, he had already put Diver down into Jolene. So the attack that Kenzo put onto Jolene sort of hit him back. The force from Diver down hit Kenzo, so his legs turned into springs. He started jumping around and landed in a trash can and got stuck, because his bones and muscles were super broken and his legs turned into springs. So honestly, I think this selection of chapters were amazing. If I had to give a name to these chapters, I would call them Jojo Stone Ocean Battle Tendency, because this is all about the fights. It's crazy how detailed these fights get using only two-dimensional pictures. The fight between Guard Westwood and Jolene is insane. At first you don't really know what Westwood's stand is, so he and Jolene are just sort of fighting. But even when Westwood isn't using the meteors to try and hit Jolene, he's crazy. He's 10 times her size. He's always dodging her attacks and grabbing her. And Jolene uses some pretty good trickery too. There's one point where she gets some string in front of her, and Westwood punches her, and his arm goes right by the string. And then she uses the string to tie up his arm, and because he went to punch with the other arm got close to the arm that was tied up. So she sort of made handcuffs for him, and then she sort of did a motion where, she was holding onto the string that was cuffing Westwood, and then she removes her jacket and tosses it over his head so he can't see. And then it's just crazy stuff like that. And there's just and the fight with Kenzo too, there's just so much maneuvering, and his stand, he's a super fighter, so he can just dodge anything. And when he's in his lucky zones, nothing can hit him, so he's always just dodging things and perfectly maneuvering around Foo Fighters' attacks. So it's really interesting the way that combat is portrayed here. It's incredibly cool, and it really is all about the fights, and I love it. Then there's another part where Westwood gets Jolene into like a super headlock, and it's crazy and it's super detailed. And then his stand, Planet Waves, is also really, really cool. All the stands in this are really unique. I know I said this in the last video, I think, but I feel like the stands in Stone Ocean are just getting more and more unique and more interesting. Like the meteors coming down, it's just so cool, and the whole Feng Shui thing, it's a really interesting concept. And that stand, Dragon's Dream, was unique also in the way that it came about, because it sort of manifested after Kenzo himself, sort of mastered the art of Feng Shui. And after he mastered that, the stand sort of appeared to help him out. And the stand, Dragon's Dream, is also kind of funny. It takes the shape of like a sort of ring, and in the center there's like a statue of like a dragon with an arrow pointing at like lucky zones. And he's kind of funny because he is like not entirely loyal to Kenzo. He's neutral, he says. So sometimes he'll give Foo Fighters some tips, or he'll like insult Kenzo, or like he'll give Kenzo some tips. He's just sort of there, and he's not like evil or good, but he's just like a funny, interesting stand, like a sentient stand, and he's cool in that way. I like him. And then there's another interesting ability that Kenzo has. He can like make people drown. So it's not a stand ability. What he does is that he reaches into people's like mouths and like goes all the way down to their adrenal gland, and like I guess he like punctures it and releases all the fluids in it, and the fluids fill people's lungs, so then the people bloat up and they like drown. And it's interesting. It's really interesting. Again, it's not a stand, but it's like a very interesting way of him like being able to fight and kill people, and it just shows that he's like a very well trained and very like ruthless fighter, and it really adds to him, and it's interesting. And that stand Survivor is also really cool. It's never revealed who the user of Survivor is. I mean, these chapters that I read only encompass the fights with Westwood and Kenzo, but like I said, there was still that other guy who showed up after the Westwood fight, so maybe he was the user of Survivor. We don't know yet. I don't know yet. So it's an interesting stand, and I'm interested to see who is the user. Also, the way like we're introduced to it is cool, because it was introduced to us in like the second chapter, or the first chapter of this arc, in a flashback with Pucci talking to Dio. Pucci asks Dio, what's the most useless stand you've ever seen? Dio says it was this one called Survivor, because it couldn't really attack anybody, and when Survivor activates, everyone gets angry, everyone gets crazy. They could kill the user, because people's allegiances, loyalties just completely die. And so everyone just goes crazy and angry and fighty. So, and they showed like how it first originated. It was in 1982 in France. Some 6 hikers went to this lodge. One of the hikers insulted the lodge owner, and the lodge owner, I guess his stand then activated, and all the hikers started fighting among themselves, and they killed each other. And then Pucci, I guess, stole the lodge owner's disc and got Survivor for himself. So it was interesting. That stand was really cool. And all the characters in this chapters were really cool too. Westwood was funny. When he first appeared in the chapters, when he first started fighting that other guard, they weren't like good people, the 2 guards, because they were like, when they first appeared, they opened Jolene's cell and hosed her down with a hose for her shower time. But then when he first started like arguing with the other guard, it was because I think he splashed the other guard, and the other guard like hit him like accidentally, and they start like bickering with each other, but sort of like in a not like maybe like in a cute, funny way, because like I don't know, they're like they seem very harmless when they're bickering with each other. They're like, oh, why'd you hit me? And then they hit him back, and he's like, oh, why'd you hit me back so hard? I didn't even hit you that hard. So they're just sort of like bickering like little kids almost, and then suddenly they start like trying to murder each other, and it gets really brutal after that. And speaking of like funny stuff, I guess there's also this part where Jolene just like flips off Kenzo in a bunch of different ways, like the American way, the Japanese way, the Italian way, the French way. It's cool, and I guess again it just shows Araki knows a lot about a lot of different places, but I don't know, it's funny, and it adds to her character, and it's something I would expect her to do. And then Kenzo was also really cool. He has a really interesting backstory. He was like a cult owner. He's very old. He's 78 when this takes place. So all those years ago, he was part of like a cult. I think he was like the leader, and it was this really odd cult. And then one day, I guess he was gonna be caught by the police because the cult was doing illegal activity. So he set the house of the cult on fire, and he was intending to do a mass suicide. But because he found himself in a lucky zone when that happened, so the house collapsed all around him, and he was like the only survivor, even though he was trying to die. He was in a lucky zone, and then after that he started mastering the art of Feng Shui, and he went to prison eventually, of course, and he has like a sentence like 280 years for all the awful things he did, but he's been mastering the art ever since, and he's a really awful, I hate him, he's like completely reprehensible, he's like so disgusting, but he's interesting. And I like Anasui in this. I kind of like Anasui in this because while Foo Fighters is fighting Kenzo, he sort of stays back because his sole purpose is to protect Jolene, which is, I guess, understandable, but he's kind of mean about it. He kind of shows that he really doesn't care about Foo Fighters at all. He just wants to marry Jolene. But there's a part which is pretty funny. He, like, out of nowhere, when he first shows up and sees Jolene, Jolene is like, "Oh, who are you?" And then the first thing he says is like, "I love you." And then she's like, "What'd you say?" And then he just like doesn't speak and his eyes go black. And it was pretty funny. He's definitely an odd character, and I don't know, I think he's like funny, I guess, and like, I don't know, and like, he's funny the way he is with Jolene, but he does seem like a bit of a jerk at times also. And then lastly, there's also just a lot of cool concepts talked about, like a lot of cool stand explanations. Like the explanation for Survivor, it's like, first they mention how the human body, like the electrical current that goes through it isn't that much. It's only like 0.07 volts. So it it specifically says that the electric current that Survivor uses is only that much, 0.07 volts. And it mentions how it weakly stimulates the limbic system to activate the fighting spirit. It's just a very interesting way of describing it. And then also the planet waves. Before like we learn what planet waves is, they go in I guess the narrator goes into a whole explanation of like how meteors go into Earth, how anything re-entering Earth has to go at a very specific angle so that it can sort of enter the atmosphere and not go directly through the atmosphere and burn up. So it mentions how it just has like a very scientific explanation of that, and then it mentions how this stand Planet Waves uses those meteors and has meteors coming at a very specific angle and then has them be attracted to the user westward. And then also the whole explanation of Feng Shui is also just very interesting because it talks about how it's like an art that was used a lot in like the East, and how like sometimes like houses would be built facing certain directions and not facing other directions, you know, to sort of maintain that luck, and how during like wartime like palaces would be built and then soldiers would like attack from certain angles just like give themselves like luck, or there's just things like that. There's a lot of explanations for it, and it's very specific, very interesting, and again, just shows like all these like little trivia that Araki has and that he puts into these stories. It's just very interesting, and it makes it a lot more engaging. And it's like, you know, these aren't like just abilities anymore. You know, they're not just like, I guess, like stands like in part 3. Those were good stands, but here they sort of have like more depth and they're interesting, and there's a lot of like trivia that goes into them, and it's just really interesting stuff. So yeah, that's it for these chapters. I think these were really interesting, and again, I love the stands. The characters are getting really interesting, and you know, even though these chapters all took place like around one event, like 2 fights in one area, they're just really cool, and the fights are very entertaining to watch. I loved it. This was crazy with all the choreography and the abilities and the twists and turns that were used. It's very interesting. I loved it, and I can't wait to see what happens next. So I'll see you guys later.